Folks who went before us blazed the trail through history. The heritage they left behind is part of you and me. All the dreams they still live on, and it makes me proud to be a living, breathing part of it all, the American legacy.
If you climbed up on top of that mountain, you'd be standing at the highest point in North America, over 20,000 feet above sea level. The Indians here have called it Denali, meaning the Great One. You and I know it better as Mount McKinley. It symbolizes what much of Alaska is really like, a rugged wilderness of unusual beauty, containing a great many resources. If we placed the state of Alaska on top of what people call the lower 48, our 49th state would stretch over much of our country, with its northern borders almost touching Canada, its panhandle extending down into Florida, the Alaska Peninsula and the Aleutian Islands reaching over to California. The state is not only large and spectacular, but it's unusual. Nowhere else in our country do you find as many tall mountains or as many active volcanoes. No other state has such gigantic ice fields, glaciers of enormous size, moving ever so slowly down mountain valleys. And where else in the United States can you see tens of thousands of caribou migrating on our far northern treeless plains called tundra? Or a camp of Eskimos preparing for the traditional whale hunt? And yet, many of us forget that Alaska has the smallest population of any of our 50 states, and that over half that population lives right here in the state's largest city, Anchorage. We also forget that almost a third of Alaska lies north of the Arctic Circle, which means that for several months each summer, the sun never sets below the horizon. Here in Denali National Park at this moment, it's 11:30 at night in the month of June, and yet it's broad daylight. This is what you would experience at this northern latitude. What about wintertime? Just the reverse at or north of the Arctic Circle. There would be several months of 24-hour darkness, along with a good deal of snow and very cold temperatures. For some, it's hard to get used to. For most, it becomes a way of life to which they adjust and accept.
I think it takes a certain type of person to want to live in Alaska. We're pretty independent up here.
It costs a little more to live here in Fairbanks than it did in Seattle because things have to be flown in by plane. On the other hand, the wages are a little higher here than they are in the lower 48.
Many people in Alaska live in isolated places. In fact, you may need an airplane to get in to see your friends.
Alaskans are sometimes called the flyingest people in the world. In fact, many of them own and fly their own float planes that can land on water, that get you where you want to go quickly, and where there are usually few, if any, roads. In this country, rivers can become driveways, lakes become parking lots. One of the greatest needs here in Alaska is to build more highways and railroads to connect all parts of the state. This is the only railroad in Alaska, and it runs only from Seward up to Fairbanks. In fact, there are no public highways or railroads connecting the southern and central parts of Alaska with what we call its North Slope. For many, many years, we knew very little about the North Slope of Alaska, or much about the people that lived there. They call themselves Inuit, which in their language refers to man or people of excellence. It's a well-deserved name, for the Eskimos are a remarkable people. In the old Eskimo culture, man was a hunter. He killed for food and skins. The hunt was the function of his life, the lives of all the Inuit. Today, that culture has changed a great deal.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are making our final descent into Barrow, Alaska. Please check to see that your seat belts are securely fastened and the backs of your seats are in the full upright position for landing. Thank you.
Barrow is the largest Eskimo settlement in the Arctic. Here, some 2,400 native men, women, and children make their home. They're part of the 4,500 Eskimos scattered across the North Slope. But no longer are they isolated from the rest of their country. Everyday jet service has changed all that. So has air cargo, bringing to them everything from milk and frozen pizza to lumber and snowmobiles. Today, these noisy runabouts are seen everywhere on the North Slope. Sledges pulled by the traditional dog team have all but disappeared.
Our old way of life has changed. We no longer use sod houses or igloos. Today, most of us live in small villages similar to Barrow. We buy the same products all Americans buy. We watch the same television programs. We send our children to school similar to those in the lower 48.
He looked up into a tree. There was a bird's nest high in the branch. He got.
And yet, some old ways will never be forgotten.
"1971 was a historic year for us Eskimos. That time the U.S. government gave us back the land which we had rightfully claimed for many, many years.
Today, the Alaskan Eskimos, through their Arctic Regional Corporation, manage much of the land on the North Slope of our 49th state. For the modern Inuit, it has meant learning about and understanding well today's business world. For under their land may be some of the richest oil property in the world. Before 1968, few people had ever heard of Prudhoe Bay, located here on the northeastern coast of Alaska. Even fewer people knew that a drilling rig was moved here for what was considered to be a last effort in trying to find oil in this part of the North Slope. Early in 1968, however, determination and persistence finally paid off. The companies had discovered the greatest accumulation of crude oil anywhere on the North American continent, perhaps as much as 10 billion barrels. Here at last was one big answer for the energy needs of the United States. But first, one big problem remained. How do you move that much oil safely and economically from this region down to the lower 48 states when the Arctic Ocean close by remains frozen shut almost 11 months each year? Well, the answer begins here at pump station number 1 at Prudhoe Bay. If after drilling, the oil is brought safely to the surface of the tundra through casing pipe, then why not carry the oil out of this Arctic region the same way? Pump it through a pipe, down across Alaska to a shipping port free of ice, where it can be safely loaded aboard oil tankers and carried to the lower 48 states. So was conceived one of the greatest engineering projects of its size in the history of the world, the Trans-Alaska Pipeline. And what a pipe, 4 feet in diameter, carrying each day 1.5 million barrels of oil from Prudhoe Bay 800 miles south across Alaska, over 3 mountain ranges and 75 streams and rivers, to the shipping port of Valdez. Here, the big tankers are filled offshore and start their long journey down along the panhandle of Alaska, bringing us much-needed oil and energy for our everyday needs. It's fortunate for us as Americans that over 100 years ago, we had a Secretary of State who wanted very much for this land that we now call Alaska to become part of the United States of America. For without William Seward's persistent efforts, the oil tankers that pass far out to sea might be going in a different direction. Or this town of Sitka, located here in the panhandle of Alaska, might look a good deal more Russian than it does. For Sitka at one time was one of the centers of Russia's great fur trading empire. Since the early 1800s, the Russian government had seen to the establishment of forts, fur trading posts, and settlements in what they called Russian America. For years, There were good profits and successes, but by 1860, competition with American and British traders had almost convinced the Russian Tsar to sell this faraway, worrisome land. That is, if anyone would buy it. Washington, D.C., the residence of the Secretary of State, William Seward.
Tonight.
You seem very determined, Mr. Secretary.
I am, Senator Sumner. Mr. de Stokel, the Russian minister, will meet us in a few hours at the State Department, and papers are being drawn up for the treaty, and now is the time to buy Russian America.
Have you seen what the newspapers are calling these negotiations? They are ridiculing you, calling such a purchase Seward's folly. Why, the Times says you're buying Russian icebergs to cover up your failures here at home.
Well, such criticism certainly doesn't help my position in getting a treaty signed and approved. That's why I need your support, Senator. Please, be seated.
Mr. Secretary, I'm just not sure I can convince my fellow senators to approve a treaty with Russia that calls for $7.2 million to be handed over for a piece of land we know almost nothing about.
Senator, that land is only going to cost 2 cents an acre. Why, it's more than twice the size of Texas, 500,000 square miles of territory. And it's not all ice and snow. Robert Kennicott and his expedition substantiated that fact with detailed reports on its resources, the mineral wealth, the land and its wildlife. And why, the fishing waters alone would substantiate opening it up for settlement.
All right. But I'll need copies of all that material to help me argue the treaty in the Senate. By the way, have you even thought about what you will call this new territory of ours?
Indeed, I have. The Aleut people on the peninsula have a word, Alieska, meaning the great land. We will pronounce it Alaska.
The treaty was signed on March 30th, 1867. In a little over a year's time, both houses of Congress in Washington, D.C. gave their approval to the treaty. And here at this site, in Old Sitka, the United States flag was raised for the first time over Alaskan soil. And yet, for many years, people argued the question, was the purchase of Alaska worth the price? Today, our government rates 33 minerals as critical to our nation's needs. 32 are found in Alaska and used productively. Each year, more than $400 million in mineral wealth comes from this state. 2 billion board feet of lumber can be cut from the forests of Alaska every 12 months, and they will still reproduce themselves indefinitely. Since 1867, the value of its fish harvest alone has totaled more than $3.5 billion. Alaska has probably the largest undeveloped water power resources on the North American continent. Water that can produce great amounts of electrical energy for cities and industries. All these resources, and yet strangely enough, it wasn't until 1959 that our United States government finally realized that Alaska should be more than just a territory of our country, that it was time for it to become the 49th state. What a bargain Seward bought for us. Over 500,000 square miles of land, wilderness, and resources. And now, with the discovery of great amounts of oil and gas, there is even greater opportunity here for growth and for development, for being part of America's future, a future based upon a rich legacy of the past.